Hello and welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Vox Cafe at Vox Day Community. I'm Rustin Smith, the pastor of Vox, and I'm here with my friend John Bowles, who's the pastor of Beggar's Table Church and Gallery in the crossroads of Kansas City, USA. And here we are continuing our conversation. So, should we just get at it or what?
Yeah, we can.
Okay.
You know, it just dawned on me that you always outdo me. I'm sitting. If you're watching the video, you can see. If you're just listening to the podcast, we're both in t-shirts.
Yeah.
But Rustin always wears like a sports jacket over the t-shirt to look good. So yeah,
it's to cover up my tattoos.
No, you look good, man. You look good. I got to bring my sports coat sometime. But yeah. So. Anyway, I do like your t-shirt though, or I guess I'm not in the t-shirt, but you've got a Star Wars t-shirt on, which
Millennium Falcon. Yeah,
it's an amazing thing.
Yeah,
one of the many things that Rustin and I bond over.
It's kind of a prerequisite for deep friendship with me.
Yeah,
Star Wars.
Yeah, so. It's like when we're kids.
Yeah,
I'll be Han Solo, and then you can be, but then we argue. You'll be, no, I'm Han Solo.
Yeah.
No, I'm Han Solo. Anyway.
Yeah.
Forgive us for the tangent. Guys, you know what we're doing this week, Rustin? We're wrapping up the Sermon on the Mount.
I know.
This is, we started a long time ago. How many weeks ago was it?
I've lost track. More than 20.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, our intuition was during COVID that we needed to listen to these words to build a life on.
Yeah.
Words that a man who hears and puts into practice will be like a man who builds his house on a solid rock. Mm-hmm. And is like, yeah, this is going to be good for this time. And I think it has been. I really do. But it's gone fast to me. I mean, it's been a lot of weeks, but it's gone fast. It feels to me like yesterday that we were talking about the Beatitudes, you know?
Yeah.
I
agree with
I have
that.
these clear memories of that.
Yeah. Well, as we said last week, some of this stuff just kind of piles on top of each other. So the Beatitudes are one of those things that are present throughout. And So I don't know if I can say it feels like it's gone fast. I just feel like we're so out of time still. And rhythm has been one of those things that we've struggled for, and of course the disruption to being able to meet in normal ways has put us out. It just goes to show the importance of rhythm as part of discipleship. You know, the habit of meeting together, as Paul wrote about, and we're all hurting for that, but doing what we can to stay creative and stay together. So for me personally, this conversation has been a real a place to come back to each week to center myself.
Yeah, me too. And I appreciate all of you who have engaged what we're doing, and really what we've been inviting you into is a conversation. This is an art of conversation. I mean, everything that we do to communicate are different art forms. So a sermon is a certain art form, and dialogue, like what we do at Beggar's Table a lot, is open it up to dialogue, and that's a certain art form, but it's not conversation. Conversation is different. What we're doing right now is conversation, and we've invited you over the past 20 weeks or whatever to have conversation. That's why podcasts are so popular, is because we listen to conversation, and it entices more conversation, and that's a good thing. That's always the hope. So
that's right.
Hopefully that's what we've done. And so we're just going to enter into the last section of Jesus' teaching here in Matthew 7. This is going to be verses 24 through 29. And, you know, we said last week that Jesus was getting ready. You could tell by his tone that he's starting to send people out. Like, here you are, and here's your words I want you to hold with you and know as you go out there. And now he really wraps it up. And we know he's wrapping it up because he starts this section with the word therefore. And that's kind of your clue that, here comes the end, because it's his way of saying everything that we just got through saying. Here's why it's important. Therefore, and when I taught on the Sermon on the Mount years and years ago, I said this may be the most important therefore in all of Scripture, because this is the Sermon on the Mount. It's the central teaching of Jesus, and so we really have to pay attention. Therefore, why was this important? And he says, everyone, I'm just going to read it here, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the wind blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's not complete, this teaching, without this little part added on. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. So there's a lot to unpack here. Yeah. And I just thought maybe we start at the beginning. Therefore, everyone who hears these words, it's good to stop there. This is directed to people who hear him. Mm-hmm. It's not directed to everyone. And I think that you and I know, because of our profession especially, that not everyone hears what's being said, right? There's a difference between just being present and actually hearing. And Jesus is saying, I love that he's always drawing attention to some of you are hearing. And to those who hear,
right. I'm often baffled how out of step I am sometimes with deep held relationships over years. I'm like, we don't even think the same thing, even though we've talked about this many times. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I sometimes say, that those who have ears will hear. The thing is, we just know that it's common for people not to hear. Yeah. But Jesus is aware of that. Yeah. And so, hey, whoever hears these words, and then he says this very...
Which, by the way, we can just go ahead and admit, which is all of us, and none of us can hear what we're not ready to hear.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally.
And we've talked about that along the way here, about pearls and swine and all of that sort of stuff. So here again, it applies. It's just this notion that we may be sitting here today not ready to hear something that would be life-changing for us to hear, and we simply cannot hear it.
We can't hear it.
And that's you and me just as much as it's anybody that we try to teach. And
it's true.
Yeah.
And everyone brings their own baggage into any kind of teaching. And I have noticed through the years that people tend to hear through their own baggage. Yeah. So, the things people will hear, I'm often amazed. Like, I know I didn't say that, but you heard that. And that's okay. That's good, because you filtered it through your life and your stuff. And
so many times someone has come up to me after a teaching and told me what they got out of it, and it's something that had never occurred to me. Yeah. And I thought, that is so good. I wish I had said that. Somehow you got it. I didn't even think it, let alone say it. Yeah. But,
we typically end Beggar's sermons with me saying, just opening it up. Yeah. Like, that's where it was like, okay, thoughts, comments. Yeah. By the way, I don't know if that's a healthy practice or not. Because it always or usually seems to take away from the power punch at the end. But the thing is, it is really amazing to hear what people have to say. Sometimes you go, wow, and usually it's really constructive. It's like, that's really a cool thing that you got from this. Yeah.
I'm always amazed how much teaching is dependent upon the listener, and and it's true in my own life of how open I am, how attentive I am, how hungry I am for something to matter at any given conversation that I'm having. And I notice that even in this. I mean, we, have gotten responses from people who are absolutely loving it, and it's just, to me, that has more to do with them than it does with any kind of quality content we're putting out.
Responses for people that aren't loving it.
Or non-responses.
Yeah. Or those, I really miss your sermons, that kind of thing. Yeah. Hey, everyone has an art form that appeals to them the most, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But there's just to put a point on it, the idea is the listening posture has so much to do with how good teaching content is. Yeah. And when you're hungry and ready to learn, it's almost like you really don't need a great teacher. You just need to be open to what God is going to say through whatever fallible teachers we are and that we have.
The key is the hunger, right?
Yeah. And openness and humility and attentiveness, readiness to learn, to absorb. Almost any average teacher will do when you come with that kind of posture.
It's good. It's good, Rustin. Yeah. That's food for thought there.
That's why I can hang out with you.
Okay. Well, it's really the next phrase here that I think in a lot of ways we're going to concentrate on, because it's kind of emphasized here. It's everyone who hears these words of mine, and then there's a huge and, puts them into practice. It's like the wise man who builds his house on the rock. Now, to put them into practice cannot be undervalued here, because that lets us know that these have not been words to simply agree with which I think we need to be reminded of in American Christianity. That this is not about nodding our heads to something that we mentally assent to. Sermons, teaching is not about just mental assent. Church is not about mental assent. That's why I have pushback to people who only care about teaching. You know, like, well, I love the teaching. I don't even have to do anything else because I just soak in teaching. It's not about that. It's always back to how we live our life and putting things into practice, which in some ways is exactly what the church is. I've said before that the church is like a practice field. You know, for the things that we learn, it's like, okay, start practicing now with each other. Ready, go. You know, let's practice this.
Yeah, it reminds me, I think we maybe have touched on this with Dallas Willard's idea of inviting people to be a disciple, is just to ask the question, is there anything that Jesus has taught that you'd like to learn how to do?
Yeah.
And then there's probably practices developed to learn how to do that.
It's really good.
That's how you start. That's how you start a life as a disciple.
Really good.
Yeah.
But this is intended to characterize the way that we live.
Yeah.
And
the way.
The way.
There it is.
And we pursue this relentlessly, and
well, that word brings to mind, I mean, the book of Acts, which years ago we did a long study in our church on the book of Acts, which we need to do again because that was fascinating. But you can search the New Testament and not find the word Christianity. You know this, but you do find the phrase "the way." It's used 7 times in Acts, and it's what early Christians called themselves, followers of the way. Paul does that when he's brought before the Roman governor Felix in Acts 24, and he's questioned, and Paul's like, he says, "I'm a member of this group called the Way." And I just think, man, we've given away the whole thing when we've forgotten the roots of that. You know, Jesus himself says, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life," and he begins with the way, that this is a way of life. And of course, that's what he's emphasizing here at the end of the sermon. It's the person who actually intends to do this stuff, to put this into practice, to follow in this way, that is going to have a solid foundation that ends up being something we call eternal life.
I hope that I can bring this up now. I hope that you're not going to resent me for this, but that's all very nice. I mean, it's the kind of thing that we just kind of sit and listen to in church. But if you think about it, okay, so I'm putting myself in the shoes of the first century followers of the way. Yeah. I'm just going to say to you, Rustin.
The sandals.
Yeah, the sandals, yeah. Okay. I just want to say to you that this sounds very cultish.
Yeah.
Like, that sounds like a cult type language. I'm a follower of the way.
Yeah.
The way of this man.
Yeah.
What do you have to say to that?
Well, it is a cult, right? So it reminds me of a girl I used to go to our church a long time ago when I talked about the way, and she was real freaked out because apparently there's some kind of modern day cult called the way, but it's not.
There is. I'm sure there is.
There's probably more than one. I'm not familiar with it. I don't want to comment on it. But the early Christians were considered a cult. And when we use the word cult, we're always thinking of abusive kinds of modern drink the Kool-Aid kind of awful things. Right. And cults tend to go that way because what the main characteristic of what qualifies as a cult is a group of people who are patterning a way of life around a personality.
Sounds a lot like what we now call Christianity.
Yeah. I mean, in some unhealthy ways. I don't know what you mean by that.
Well, I mean, patterning our life after a personality.
If we were patterning it after the personality of Jesus, then I think that would be a healthy thing.
Right.
Rather than around a celebrity pastor.
I meant after Jesus. Yeah.
But so in that sense, Christianity very much is a cult.
It is, isn't it?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. It's patterned around the way of life of a personality. Of course, the difference is Jesus is not among us as a active, living, flesh and blood person. He was somebody who was crucified. Yeah. And yet this cult kept on patterning their life around him, which was different than any other cult that anybody had imagined.
Yeah, that distinguishes it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we're not drinking Kool-Aid per se, but we're drinking blood. I mean, this is drinking blood and eating the body, and the early church was accused of being cannibals or vampirism, and you can understand this is cultish language, and the word cult even comes from is the same root as culture.
That's
right?
right.
They're related, and that's what cults are. Is they are breeding their own culture that you pattern your life
because
after.
A culture is a way of life, a collection of behaviors and attitudes and ritual.
Yeah.
And so I think that brings up something that's very important for today's conversation, because we are talking about making decisions really here about are we interested in putting these words into practice and building our lives around this? Are we interested in entering the culture of the Jesus way and calling that Christianity?
Right.
Rather than a mental assent or a prayer that we prayed one time or a decision we made or that our parents made, or are we going to take on this way of life and put these words into practice and construct a life on top of these words? Are we going to enter the culture? And what that brings up is this idea that I think often we come to church thinking that we're coming from some sort of neutral place. That visitors come into our church and they're not religious. And so they come in as kind of a blank slate. And would you like to take up this religion to replace your non-religion? Right? In fact, it's a big movement right now in sociology to label a growing number of people, really in every age demographic, who are identifying as what they call nuns, as in no religious affiliation, nuns. And that's fascinating because this idea of culture kind of pushes against that, because everyone is part of a culture. And this pathway of discipleship to Jesus is really, I would assert, and you would too, about laying down a culture, a way of life around a certain personality, and picking up a different way of life around a different personality. And that just is an assertion that I don't want to make too much of it, but as we probably have both said, there is no such thing as non-religious. The question is, what religion, what set of practices are organizing your experience of spirituality, which is what religion is, and it's what culture is. Culture is a set of practices built around your experience of something that's transcendent, whether it be certain values or an experience that's unexplainable. So all we're saying here is this transition to put this into practice is leaving the cult of the wider culture and coming into the cult of Jesus.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So it goes without saying that, as we've said over and over just now, this is not just about mental assent. This is not just about agreeing with. This is not about just learning. And this is not just about getting to heaven. This is not just about, being on the right side of heaven and hell. This is about really the whole emphasis of Jesus' main thrust of teaching is about putting things into practice.
It bears emphasizing that Jesus gets to the end of this, his most central and famous teaching, and he does not say what every Western preacher has said for the last 200 years in the West. Now, would you like to make a decision to put your trust, your abstract trust in this person so that you get a reward at the end of your life? Jesus is talking about making a decision to put your trust, but it's the trust in his teaching, what he has to say about what reality is.
A large part of the Sermon on the Mount was about trust and placing trust in him, but it was very practical. It had to do, if you remember, with like money and clothes and food and being taken care of on a daily basis.
It's another word for trust, and maybe we could translate it differently, as one author recently has, the word allegiance. Where is your allegiance? And of course that begins to step on our toes as people, who have that as part of our vernacular in different ways in our culture. But trust is a faith, or faith is trust. It's confidence in someone, and allegiance too. And which harkens back to Bonhoeffer and where we began on this whole thing.
Right.
Bonhoeffer's conviction in 1930s Germany was that the church needed to be renewed by what he called a new kind of monasticism. And by that he meant Christians who were committed to practicing Christianity as a way of life. When you think of monks and monastics, what distinguishes them is they actually do things that make them Christian. They pray together and they work with their hands and they share a communal life. So it's not just a belief to them. It's not a mental assent, as you said, but it's a way of life. So that's what Bonhoeffer meant. he said that the renewal of Christianity would come from a new type of lived Christianity, a way, and that way had to be centered around an uncompromising allegiance to the Sermon on the Mount as the center of that way of life.
Right. The Sermon on the Mount was the central aspect of,
Yeah.
I mean, that's so good. And Bonhoeffer said that in 1930s. And of course, it begs the question, has it happened? That's what I want to ask. Like, has the church...
he tried it and he got killed by the state for it. And
has the church, are we living a new monasticism that centers around putting into practice the Sermon on the Mount?
Well, I mean, one way to ask that, and I'm not like an anti-culture combative sort of personality. I'm always looking for like where are the traces of God and everything. And
you're wearing a Star Wars shirt.
Well, right.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think one of the clues is like is our way of life, our actual lived behavior, anything that is distinguishable from the wider culture. Is there any evidence that we're laying down this culture and picking up this culture?
Yeah.
And I don't mean by it's another thing worth saying is we're not talking about isolation and monasticism as in separation from the world in a withdrawing kind of sense, because the best of even monasticism, not that I'm here to make a case for monastics, but the best of that was always deeply engaged in the world and for the world, which I would contend is the church's calling too. But is there a distinguishable way of living that we are actually practicing?
Yeah.
That's the challenge, right?
That is the challenge, and it's a relevant conversation in today's climate, and coronavirus world, and Black Lives Matter world, and even the election world. I mean, there's so many different ways to take that conversation.
Yeah, we are thoroughly discipled as Republicans and as Democrats and as institutionalists and anti-institutionalists and as in all sorts of directions, we are thoroughly discipled into a culture, into a religion. And I think until we can acknowledge that, I don't think we can begin making the shifts necessary to taking seriously this invitation of Jesus.
Yeah, it's good. It brings to mind that Dallas Willard wrote years and years ago, because I remember talking about this when Beggar's Table just started, but he had he talked about the VIM, the VIM, and he said that this was a formula for helping us to transform our hearts and maybe live more in agreement with the Sermon on the Mount. And he said, so VIM stands for vision, intention, and means. So what we need, first of all, is we have to have a vision for what this life could be like, which I think is what the Sermon on the Mount really is in many ways. I mean, much of Scripture gives us a really beautiful vision. But the Sermon on the Mount is one of the premier places for that vision. That's what Jesus is doing, is laying out the vision. I think one of the reasons that we read that the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught with authority, is because they were blown away by this vision. It wasn't just that Jesus was, I don't even think it was that Jesus was challenging the law, the sacred holy law that they held to or had been taught, but it's that Jesus was interpreting the law, and that he was making it come alive for them. As we've said before, he was making it fleshed out and real, and he was showing how there was life in it, and people were amazed at that. But all of that is part of a vision, right? And so we have this vision, and if you and I have been faithful to the way of Jesus as teachers, we've helped to flesh out that vision for people that have engaged this. But then Dallas Willard says you have to have intention, meaning that it's not enough just to have a vision put out in front of you. You have to want to change. Remember how we talked about our hearts are wanters? And we are creatures of desire, and what we desire says everything about us. And so we have to have the intention in our desire to really become Jesus, to become follow in the way of Jesus, to become a follower, not a fan of Jesus, right?
Oh, that's good. Follower, not a fan.
Not a fan.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be using that language on Sunday, I think. But
intention, though, it reminds me of the famous G.K. Chesterton quote where he says that it's not that Christianity has been tried and found wanting; it has been found difficult and left untried.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So there, Willard, when he's talking about the intention, he's just acknowledging that there has to kind of be this fortitude of deciding. Yeah. Like we have to actually intend to become what Jesus is inviting us to here.
At some point in life, if you're going to do something other than just falling into the current of the culture that everyone of America, let's just say.
Which is a powerful current.
It's a powerful current. If you're going to step out of that current and be anything different, you're going to have to desire it. You're going to have to be intentional about it. Yeah. You're just going to have to, because it's so powerful, you're not going to step out without that.
You're going to have a compelling vision that is so strong that it makes it possible for you to want to.
That's a good way to say it.
But then you're going to have to intend to actually do it.
And that's what I think Jesus addresses, that even the attention in the Sermon on the Mount. Like when he talks about where your treasure is, there your heart is also. That's what I love, that visual image of your treasure being anchored to your heart, and where you throw it, your heart goes. So if you're in the current of the mainstream culture, you have to throw that treasure outside of that current to let your heart get. It's all. It's good. The intentionality. Yeah. So you've got the vision, intention, and then the M stands for the means. There has to be means, like we would say, practical things that you can do
or methods or practices.
Yeah, practices. Puts them into practice. Yeah. The practices that you do to help your desire come to fruition, that will get you out of that current into a new current. Yeah.
Practices. So, another word for that would be disciplines, which is connected to the very word disciples.
Right.
And the idea that we could be disciples without embracing disciplines is nonsense.
Yeah.
Right. So the disciplines would be the methods and the means that make it possible for us to step into this vision of life. So do any come to mind? I mean, Jesus has talked about this all the way through, hasn't he?
And they're even in the Sermon on the Mount. Okay. And so kind of going back to his audience is really, it's not necessarily everyone there. It's those who hear.
Those who hear.
and if you look closely throughout the whole Sermon on the Mount, he's addressing those who hear. Yeah. Because he talks about methods and disciplines, but he even says, when you do this, like, if you're someone who's not doing these methods, it's almost like, I'm not addressing you. It's when you pray, when you give alms, when you fast, those are all disciplines. Yeah. And then he talks about proper ways to do those. Do them in secrecy, not for attention, the motivation, so he's addressing methods in the Sermon on the Mount too.
Boy, it just comes to mind, and I want to be careful not to, to place myself under judgment above all, but how many times am I so over particular about how people pray rather than whether or not I'm praying,
Yeah, right.
or in these days, how the church is meeting or handling different things, and when I'm not even showing up to the things that are happening, or I just run into it constantly. We tend to retreat into this mental, what Richard Rohr calls the top 5 inches of our body.
Right.
And we think that that's where all the action happens, that agreeing with the right things or making the right decisions as a church or praying or, worship wars or what color is the carpet, of course, is the silliness of what we will argue about when we're not even intending or actually doing any of the basic things.
Yeah.
And boy, I can see it in myself this week, so it's frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah. So we are, now I'm drawing a blank on the author that said that we are heads on a stick, or we're bobblehead Americans. In other words, it's so difficult for all of us because we have been trained to really glorify our heads and our mental capacity and
the command center.
Yeah. You can tell that Jesus comes from a place that doesn't do that. That's why he's emphasizing our practices rather than just, I love hearing teaching. It's no, this is about living this out. And
there's almost, I just think of it as kind of price of admission. And we've made it this far this week without talking about C.S. Lewis, but boy, he looms large over all of this with his brilliance. And but his whole thing was, you can't possibly even begin to critique something unless you've first given yourself over to it. When you're reading something, you have to kind of take it and believe it and do it, step into it, and then whether or not it holds up. Is it true? Is it? And I think that's very much this life. Unless you're in it, your commentary is really nonsensical about it.
That's good.
My commentary.
Yeah. Right.
Our commentary.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. So, Rustin, before we run out of time here, I want to get to what I think is a really big question. And I don't know if you'll have an answer to this. I don't even know if I do. We'll have to talk about it together. But when we hear Jesus' words and we put them into practice, we're promised a blessing. But it's worth noting that blessing is not that we avoid hardship. He says, when the winds blow and beat against the house and the rain comes down, the streams rise. It's interesting now because my mother-in-law lives in Gulf Shores and she's dealing with hurricanes. And so I feel like I'm reading a description of a hurricane here.
Yeah.
But he's basically, but in truth, I mean...
Winds, rains, rising water.
All of that, yeah. And then I think to myself, that this culture in the first century was largely an agrarian culture. So what they feared the most was probably bad weather and floods and that kind of thing. So he's addressing their fear really specifically. Our fears are certainly hurricanes if you live in the Gulf Shore, like my mother-in-law, or wildfires if you live in California or Oregon or Colorado even. Yeah. But for all of us, it's viruses with no vaccine, and it's
layoffs
and social injustice, and a downward spiraling economy, and uncertainty about the leadership of the country, which is all going on right now. I mean, all of these fears. So the promise, the blessing here is not that we won't have to face those. All of those things will come when it happens, he says. But what is the blessing? Obviously, it's that a man will build his house on a solid rock. But what does that mean for us? What happens to the person who really hears Jesus and puts his words into practice? That's my question. I have somewhat of an answer. But
well, that probably bears more reflection because we're recording this and I'm on the spot. I'm immediately looking for a way out of the question, but I would just go back to Jesus' own words, who is saying that the house stands.
And just in full vulnerability, you know why that's hard for us to answer is because we just got through having a conversation before this conversation about how we both feel a certain struggle right now. Yeah. I think everyone is struggling in these times that we're living in, and the unknown is taking its toll on our own souls. Yeah. And so, but all the more reason why it's good for us to pause and say, wait, what's the blessing?
Yeah.
What is it that we get here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Why are we doing all this anyway?
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that comes to mind is what you'd already said, is that you can put these words into practice or not. Either way, the winds are going to beat, the rain's going to come, floods are going to rise. That's the given for both sets of people, right?
Your life is not going to get easier. I'll just tell everyone. It's not going to get easier.
No.
Yeah.
No, in fact, that whole idea of stepping out of one culture and religion in which we're already thoroughly discipled, even against our will and unknowingly, and beginning to deconstruct that and to lay those things down and pick up a completely different way of life that is going to cause all sorts of estrangement from all sorts of things.
Kind of makes it harder in some ways.
In some ways, that's going to be harder. So, I mean, I guess I'm just adding to your question. Why in the world are we...
I've always thought, just between you and me, I've always thought that it makes your life so much harder because you're so different that you need the church.
Yeah.
So if there, in some way you're a Christian and you don't need the church, there's something you're not doing right because you find yourself needing that community that's trying to step in line with you.
That you're talking about ecclesiology now. Yeah. What is the church, the form and nature of the church? And I think that is a big piece of it, is that we are given the church because precisely this is so difficult to do, that it can't really be done without community.
So my clue, if I feel like, you know what, I'm a Christian, I don't really need the church, that's a great clue that I'm not doing something. I'm probably more in the mainline stream current still than I thought I was. Yeah.
And you can always be sure that you are. And someone said, one way we know that our Christian commitments, our allegiance to Christ, is not as deep as our allegiance to our culture, is because we grow up in this culture and we get to decide whether or not we want to follow Jesus. But no one ever asks us if we want to be an American, or if we want to be Western, or if we want to be individualistic or materialistic or therapeutic, or those things are a given. You are those all the way down from the beginning. You're thoroughly those things.
Yeah, we're trained in that from the beginning.
The question is, do you want to step out of that those religions and into a different one.
Not an easy invitation.
No, it's not easy.
But now, the shrewd listener would say they're kind of avoiding the question. What is the blessing?
Yeah.
What is it?
What do you got?
So, what do I have?
Yeah.
Well,
you asked the question, so you've got a head start on at least maybe having a thought on this.
Yeah. Okay, so when I think of the storm coming, I just think, all right, obviously the blessing isn't avoiding the storm.
Yeah.
But if my house is built on a rock, it means the storm doesn't sink me. And what does sinking look like? I don't even know. It just... For some reason, it means, I think, of perseverance. It means that I'm able to persevere. It means that I'm maybe able to have a sail and a compass that help me navigate through a storm. I can't help but think of wisdom, that putting Jesus' words into practice are going to give me a certain amount of wisdom that helps me to be able to read the moment well and make wise decisions, which again won't necessarily keep me out of trouble.
Right.
In some cases might get me into more trouble.
Usually.
But I think it's an issue of character. I think that I will be able to be the kind of person that people would look at and say, I think that I could ask some advice of that person, right? Or want to see that, ask how they live, how they, how do they attain that kind of quality of life?
Yeah.
It's like a quality of life that usually when we hear the term quality of life, we think of material wealth and vacations and cars and clothes and stuff, but there's a different kind of quality of life that has peace, right?
Yeah.
So it seems like the storm is raging, but there's a chance to have peace within the storm. Not suggesting that I have found it fully, but I think that that's kind of part of a man whose house is on a rock seems to have a certain amount of peace. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's desirable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, take that for what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's an amazing promise, and this is one that I got early on growing up in the church. I grew up in a bad Sunday school, probably like a lot of Christians, and we sang this song. The wise man builds his house upon the rock, and it stands firm. And if you haven't suffered, you just wait. These rains, I know it's metaphorical. I think people get that. But you hang around long enough, you try to do anything with your life that's worth anything, and you're going to suffer. You're going to suffer. I mean, this year, if you don't know about suffering yet, for goodness sake, as you enumerated, from political leadership to racial strife to pandemic, loss of community and relationships. But if not that, then it's death of a family member, it's loss of a child, it's loss of a vocation, or death of a dream. Those things are coming. If you don't know them intimately already, they're coming. And so, to me, this invitation was always a life preserver. It was like, there is a way that you can meet those things as life comes, and it will not collapse you. Somehow there will be something about you that is enduring, that will last beyond that.
Yeah.
And I don't know exactly even how to talk about it more than that, but I want that. I mean, Jesus is pinging a desire even in me now, as I, like everyone else, suffer through everything that this year is beginning to mean, which is not getting easier as things go. I want that, what he's talking about.
Yeah. It's good. It's good words. I don't know if this metaphor helps or not, and if it doesn't, you should just edit it right out. But here's where my mind went while you were talking. Carrie and I will often, as our kids get older, teenagers and that kind of thing, we're just like, there's a lot of heartache involved in being a parent, right? Yeah. And then I kind of realized it doesn't matter, even if our kids are great kids, there's still heartache. There's just heartache. It's like, well, you know what? Heartache is just coming. That's just part of it. It's a lot of heartache.
You taught me years ago that it's even part of the good things, because if you talked about how you loved your kids at every stage, but you also felt the loss as they progressed through every stage, because you missed what they were even then. Yeah. So there is a sense of loss all the way through.
There's a sense of loss.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to embrace loss in relationship, especially with your kids, because you're continually saying goodbye to them.
Yeah.
You're saying hello to new versions of them, but you're saying bye to versions of them that are gone,
Right.
So anyway, that's all. a deep conversation, but I don't know if this will make sense, but when Palmer, speaking of our kids, when he was in middle school, he hung out with a crowd of kids. They were fine kids, but I remember the parents would all get together and talk like the kids had arrived. And they would all talk about what great kids. We're so lucky because our kids are all so good. Our boys are just great. And I remember thinking, the journey hasn't begun yet. You have no idea. Our kids are in 7th grade. We're not ready just to throw in the towel and say our kids are great. We've done a good job. Yeah. And then sure enough, when the kids hit high school, it's just funny. All the parents that were ready to call it quit, like, we've done good. Yeah. Our kids, we're lucky. Yeah. We can just sit back and drink our wine and celebrate. Right. Kids hadn't even hit high school yet. No. And then so many of those kids hit high school and just went berserk, Right. I mean, as high school kids will do. Yeah. And it was just interesting to see that whose family / house was on a solid foundation, and what houses were really built on sand with the illusion, as they began to crumble. So, yeah.
Well, of course, it's easy to witness, and of course, some people don't hit those major storms until they're in their 40s. So
yeah, right. Okay, so the more I think about it, the more I think we should edit that out. It didn't come to fruition the way I wanted it to.
That's good. If anything, it's a little too close to home and uncomfortable.
Yeah. I don't know, Rustin, if it's okay with you, I'm thinking of maybe wrapping us up by reading this passage from Matthew 7 by Eugene Peterson.
Oh, it's so good. Eugene Peterson, of course, translated what's known as the Message translation, and it's a great read-along. I love to read it alongside a more traditional translation, and it works almost as a commentary with fresh language.
Yeah. So good. So, hear these words. These words I speak to you are not incidental additions to your life, homeowner improvements to your standard of living. They are foundational words to build a life on. If you work these words into your life, you are like a smart carpenter who built his house on solid rock. Rain poured down, the river flooded, a tornado hit, but nothing moved that house. It was fixed to the rock. But if you just use my words in Bible studies and don't work them into your life, you're like a stupid carpenter who built his house on the sandy beach. When a storm rolled in and the waves came up, it collapsed like a house of cards. When Jesus concluded his address, the crowd burst into applause. They had never heard teaching like this. It was apparent that he was living everything he was saying. Quite a contrast to their religious teachers. This was the best teaching they had ever heard. Yeah. Amen?
Amen.
Amen.